it was never black and white, rich and poor, young and old. It was, those who were willing to stand up for what was right, regardless of how they were born, and those who, could not appreciate and love others who were different.
You met Dr. King before you worked with him. Can you talk about meeting him and what drew you to him?
Well, actually, I was pastoring a little country church in South Georgia, Thomasville and Beachton. And I was invited to Talladega College for Religious Emphasis Week. We both happened to be members of the same fraternity, and they invited him, and I said they weren't sure that he would come, so they invited me as a backup, and we both showed up. I don't remember what we talked about, but I was a little country preacher with 50 members in 2 churches, and I'd run a voter registration drive, but I knew about him, and I had actually heard him speak in Tallahassee at Reverend C. Seals Church, but so I was in awe. But we basically talked to college students, more or less reflecting on our own ordinary, not so special college years. I think both Martin and myself grew up in a fairly privileged circumstance. I mean, there was all the difference in the world between Atlanta and New Orleans and Marion, Alabama, Selma, Alabama, Thomasville, Beachton, Georgia. We were protected from racism and segregation pretty much in the big cities. And it was there, but we were taught to deal with it, not to be victims, and were taught that racism was a sickness, and it was the white people who were sick, not you. And you don't get mad with sick people, and you don't get upset with them. They just don't know any better. They've been taught that they are better than you, but you know that God created all of us in his image. God created of one blood all of the nations of the earth. And for some reason, they have a problem with that. But that's not our problem. I think while we had sort of spiritual defenses that were part of our growth growing up, we never had them tested. Whereas our wives had been tested and been through the fire, and somehow realized that you could come out without being burned. I always say that at that time at Talladega, I don't know whether I realized it then, but that's not just a coincidence. And I've learned to say that coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. And that, but if we had not married these 2 little country girls who had in the fire built up in their bones to fight racism and segregation, and not to fear death or walk through the valley of the shadow of death and fear no evil. They were some courageous women who never tried to hold us back. In fact, they were always pushing us forward. And I don't know whether you would have heard of either of us if we had not married these 2 women.
And that's in the 1950s. Could you skip forward to 61 when you're up in New York and the decision to come south to work with him?
Well, there again, I was working with the National Council of Churches. I had been in Thomasville and Beachton, Georgia, and I went down to Florida in 1956, 57 to do Bible study at an interracial church conference. And I was offered a job in New York as the Associate Director of Youth Work for the National Council of Churches. Well, actually, Jean did not want to go. She wanted to stay in the South. I was enjoying myself, but at that time, they actually said that the young people in the churches, black and white, need help to go through this difficult period. And while you're moving to New York and would be based in New York, most of your work will be with young people across the nation, but especially in the South. It gave me an exposure to young people all over the nation. It also got me involved internationally with the church's movements of liberation movements in Latin America and South Africa, Southern Africa, and was a particularly good experience for me. Jean had been to Germany in a work camp with the Church of the Brethren back in '53, and I tagged along with her there and worked in Austria. So our work with the churches gave us a significant amount of global awareness of what was going on in the world of race and creed and class and color. But we were looking at television, put the kids to bed, and we had just bought a house in Queens and had a fire in the fireplace and was sitting down, and the Nashville Sit-In story comes on. And we see C.T. Vivian and Martin Luther King and Diane Nash and James Bevel and Kelly Miller Smith and John Lewis. And I think John Lewis particularly was a powerful, moving figure that Jean immediately related to. When the program went off, she said, "It's time for us to go home." I said, "We just bought this house. This is home." She said, "No, this is not home. It's time for us to go back south." I ended up moving to Atlanta and being placed in an office that was right across the hall from Martin Luther King. And I was not officially on SCLC staff, but Dora McDonald, Dr. King's secretary, said to me, your family's in Alabama and you're here by yourself. Maybe I was living at the YMCA. Maybe you could help with Dr. King's mail. So I said I'd be glad to try. And she brought me a cardboard box, packed down with all of the people who were writing him letters. And I took it over to the YMCA, and that's what I did for my orientation. I read and answered, all of his mail.
You were there, and he insisted on going straight to Selma. What do you remember about the commitment? Was that a surprise?
Actually, the idea of redeeming the soul of America from the triple evils of racism, war, and poverty was actually out of the first SCLC gathering in 1957 in New Orleans. And so that had always been a theme that we probably didn't use until it surfaced in his Nobel Prize lecture. We came back from the Nobel Prize lecture, and we went to New York. We were met at the Harlem Armory by Governor Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller, and Malcolm X. And Malcolm was there to congratulate Martin, but he said, "I think it's important for us to keep our work separate, but I want you to know that I have a great deal of admiration and respect for everything you're trying to do. And anything I can do, I'll be glad to do to help you, but I don't think it's good for us to be seen or work together." So he left the Armory. When Dr. King got up to speak, Governor Rockefeller, when Martin decided to give the money of the Nobel Prize to the 6 civil rights organization, divided evenly, Governor Rockefeller decided to match it. So the amount doubled. And he offered us his plane to fly us down to Washington to meet President Johnson. So when we got there, the president was in the midst of a very heavy burden, war and domestically. And so we made our case that we really needed voting rights, and he agreed and said that he wanted to do a lot more on poverty and also voting rights. And I think the only difference was that I think he was more concerned about going into poverty first. And he felt that it was less divisive. And President Johnson's notions of poverty were not just black poverty. His experiences with poverty were from the hills of East Texas. And he had taught children, which he knew were coming to school with no food for breakfast. And we were pushing voting rights. And we would make a case, or Dr. King would make a case, and President Johnson would agree, but he'd always end with saying that, look, I just got a bill through Congress 6 months ago on civil rights and public accommodations. I just don't have the power to go back to the Congress for Voting Rights Act in this session of Congress. And Dr. King kept pressing the case, and President Johnson kept agreeing with him, but saying, you're right, but I don't have the power. When we left, and I asked Dr. King, well, what do you think? His answer was I thought he was joking. He said, well, we got to figure out how to get this president some power. I said, come on now. You're going to get the president of the United States some power. And the school rivalry, Howard and Morehouse. I said, now, you Morehouse men, we always say you can tell a Morehouse man, but you can't tell him much. But this is a new level of arrogance from you. You're going to get the president of the United States some power. And he was serious. He said, look, I'm not being flippant. He said, we just have to find a way to get this president some power. And when I realized he was serious, but he didn't have a clue of where the power would come from and how it would come about, I didn't realize it then. But I think that he had already come to be aware from the combination of his death threats and stabbing in in New York, and the midnight ride and the jailing in solitary confinement in Georgia, that I think he'd already come to grips with death, and that his view of the movement was never, and I don't know exactly where it happened, but somewhere between Montgomery and Selma, the movement ceased to be political for him. It was spiritual. And I was still thinking politics, but he was not thinking politically.
I'd like to shift to talking about Dr. King and anger, but not anger. There were times when he was given to depression.
I remember I'd rather say his battles with conscience. I mean, as much as he did, he always blamed himself for not doing enough. And like he was trying to take the blame, he let Bobby Kennedy put him on a guilt trip. And he was very depressed that he hadn't been more forceful in his nonviolence. And that I said, wait a minute, this is not, you're not savior of the world. You're doing better than anybody else is doing. There's no reason for you to feel guilty, but he always felt he was not doing enough, that he took the burden and blame on himself. And and those were periods when he was really just physically exhausted. The only time, well, actually, when he received word of the Nobel Prize, he was in the hospital. And there wasn't anything wrong with him except that he got so hopped up and so revved up that, he couldn't relax at home. And the doctor checked him in the hospital basically to slow him down. It was there, I think, because of his feeling that somehow he wasn't good enough to be the leader. So, he'd feel guilty about getting a Nobel Prize and that he didn't deserve it. And one of the most beautiful scenes I remember was him being in the hospital and Archbishop Hallinan of the Catholic Church coming in to congratulate him on winning the Nobel Prize. And I moved away from them and they were talking, and Bishop Hallinan said, "Well, I must be on my way. May I give you my blessing?" And Martin said, "Oh, of course." And so he made the sign of the cross and mumbled something in Latin. And then he knelt down beside the bed and said, "May I receive yours?" I said, "Damn." I never thought I'd see an archbishop of the Roman Catholic Church getting on his knees to a black Baptist preacher named Martin Luther. How far have we come?
Could you talk a little bit about Dr. King's personal side, his sense of humor, his practical joking?
He would make you laugh at your own death. And he would say, in fact, when we went to Birmingham, the CBS reporter, who had been with us since Montgomery, said, "Andy, look, I got to keep a camera on Martin." He said, "And I know you don't like us around with the cameras, but if he gets shot and I don't have a picture of it, I lose my job." And Martin heard that, and he said, "Well, I'm not worried about that, but somebody's going to probably have to give their life for Birmingham." He said, "It's probably going to be one of you guys jumping in the front of the camera trying to get your picture taken that will take the bullet that's meant for me. But don't worry, I think I can preach you into heaven." And then he would start preaching your funeral. And he would do a very sadistic caricature of all of your faults and foibles and things that you would never want said about you in public. And he'd weave it into a sermon, and quite often he'd have a similar demon from the Bible who had the same problems. And by the time he got through, he had everybody laughing at what was a life and death situation, mostly his life. And so he was prepared to die, but he was also determined that his death and his life would have meaning. And he used to say that to us all the time. You're going to die. And you can never say what you die how you're going to die, when you're going to die, or where you're going to die. Your only choice is what you give your life for. And I've heard him say that 40 or 50 times in different situations. And he was warning us, but I think at the same time, he was reminding himself that whenever his end came, he wanted it to be for the purpose of the least of these God's children. And that's why when we tried to stop him from going to Memphis, we did not want him to go to Memphis at all. There was no need. The strike was going to go on. They had a big union staff running it. A number of pastors were supporting them. And we wanted him to go on to New York. I told him that, you need to go ahead and sleep till about noon tomorrow. We don't have to be in Washington until, 6, 7 o'clock. When we catch a 3 o'clock shuttle and have an easy day, you need the rest. And he said, no, I'm going to catch the 6 o'clock flight to Memphis. I think I had gotten to the point where I really thought we were beyond the dangers. He'd already been stabbed and jailed and beaten and everything. And he'd won a Nobel Prize, and other than J. Edgar Hoover, we were, doing extremely well with almost everybody on the planet. And so I didn't see the urgency. I mean, I thought it was okay to take a sabbatical. When you're 38 years old, you don't have to die at 39. Wait till 45, say, or 55. But it was sort of, I think he used to say that some of us are not going to live to be 50. So you better live good now and live a righteous life. And he was constantly, it was almost as though he saw death as an escape, and that he could not escape the way we wanted him to escape. He couldn't put it off. He couldn't run from it. And it was more for me like Jesus' disciples trying to keep him from going to Jerusalem.
I know you must be asked an awful lot about the last day and your reaction and to all of that, but what do you carry with you about that last time?
I hadn't talked to him all day. In fact, I didn't even talk to him before I went to court. I was trying to let him get as much sleep as possible, so I got to court, at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I hadn't touched base with him all day, but I was on the witness stand most of that day. And I really don't remember what it was about, except that I think I was able to answer all of the questions that they challenged us with, and we got permission to stage the march the next few days. And when I got back, he was, childish and giddy, and cussed me out, threw a pillow at me. I threw it back. He was, where you been? But it was the happiest I had seen him in a long time. His brother was there. Ralph was there. It was all his inner circle. And they had been almost having a Last Supper because somebody had brought in a whole load of catfish. He was just extremely relaxed and comfortable and playful. And when he started beating me with the pillow, I kind of feebly fought back, but everybody else picked up pillows, and it was like a bunch of 10-year-olds. But his last moments on earth were amongst the happiest that he had in a long time.